So this morning in the daily brief, I promised that I would talk about this topic next, drone warfare and how it is destroying the Russian army. It is really phenomenal what has happened, how the battlefield has changed irreparably for the future. And every military on earth better be paying attention to this. Okay, so this is from an article, the best article that I've read on drone warfare in the entire war. How Ukraine Can Win, Part 1, the Drone Revolution That's Dismantling Russia's Army. Destroying thousands of armored vehicles, Ukrainian drones, mines, and artillery are steadily depriving Russia of the mobility its forces need for major advances in Ukraine. This demechanization, that's a good way of explaining what's happening, demechanization is one way Russia loses and Ukraine wins. And it's really interesting to see how in the beginning of the war, we didn't even see that this was going to be possible. Yeah, they had some drones, but it wasn't enough. Like, you could still send in your armored column to just go intimidate Kyiv and just plunge right through. It's all World War II tactics, a blitzkrieg, right? And it didn't work out so well. The Ukrainians are swiftly demechanizing what was the world's leading mechanized army. If they can finish what they've started, they could render the Russian army immobile and incapable of major offensive action. So there's basically two ways of warfare. Attritional warfare, you just line up and you kind of shoot at each other, and mechanized or mobile warfare, where you try to maneuver and move around your opponents. And there's a huge advantage if you can maneuver and they can't. Soviet thinkers since 1920s devised a new doctrine for mobile warfare on battlefields dominated by artillery, where to slow down was to die in place. And so if you can be mobile, and not just mobile, but protected because you're in armor, you have a huge advantage. But the article continues, no epoch lasts forever. Outgunned by the Russian army and on the cusp of losing everything in the spring of 2022, the Ukrainian military embraced new century-defining technology. The drone. This is why I harp on drones so much when I'm doing my videos, especially in the daily brief, showing you what drones have done to devastate the other side. And in fairness, the Russians have drones as well. They're not as good with them, but they have them as well. And they have been wreaking havoc on Ukrainian forces. But the Ukrainians have been doing more to the Russians than the Russians have been doing to the Ukrainians. And because drones do what drones do, it kind of equalizes the thing. Okay, so think about the Battle of Salamis. In the Battle of Salamis, there's naval war, and the ships lined up in such a way that it gave the Greeks an edge over their opponents, and that's kind of what's happening here. Okay, and now Ukraine's drones are destroying so many Russian vehicles so fast that entire Russian regiments, each with 1,000 or more troops, have begun riding into battle on Chinese-made motorcycles and all-terrain vehicles, golf carts, basically, as well as old Soviet compact cars, trucks, and vans. That's not nearly as protected as being in a tank, but being in a tank isn't really even protected anymore. The most desperate regiments have even equipped their reconnaissance and assault troops with rechargeable electric scooters. Wow. Okay, yeah, I've seen that, and that's just, it's terrible. I showed these regularly, like Russian infantry on motorcycles. It's absolutely terrible. Your survival rate is pitiful. This demechanization, it's tearing up an entire chapter of Russian military history, rendering obsolete concepts, training, hardware Moscow is counting on to achieve any kind of victory in Ukraine. Yeah, so former military doctrine would have been like, roll in a mass. Nobody's going to attack you if you're this massed, and like they don't want a suicide, so they're not going to. They'll leave you alone because you're that big and formidable. Now you look at that same mass and you go, wow, look at all those juicy targets to send in these swarms of drones, and it's changed everything. Russia widened its war on Ukraine in February of 2022 on the backs of tens of thousands of armored vehicles. Heavily armored, thickly armored tanks led lighter, troop-carrying infantry fighting vehicles. That's normal combined warfare, right? Tanks don't do it alone. Infantry doesn't do it alone, but together, and then with air support, you have something really powerful. Behind them trailed armored trucks and lighter tracked support vehicles. Even the rearmost vehicles, howitzers, and mobile air defenses traveled on thick tires or metal tracks and had some degree of armored protection. But it was this horde of mobile metal that nearly reached Kyiv in the heady first few weeks of the wider war. But it advanced too quickly and too far for its supply lines and got hit on its flanks by Ukrainian infantry packing shoulder-fired Javelin anti-tank missiles. More ominously for the Russians, their columns came under fire from above by Ukraine's small force of Turkish-made TB2 drones firing tiny precision munitions. So the Javelins slowed them down and, stopped them, blocked them, whatever. And then those drones just rained down fire on them, and they didn't see that kind of thing coming. It took a few days after the shock and violence of the initial Russian attack on 24 February 2022 for the TB2 operators to prepare their 640-kilogram propeller-driven unmanned aerial vehicles to fly. Once they did, the drones opened an ever-widening robotic offensive. I like the language of that because that's really what the story of the war is. There's a robotic offensive. By 20 March, foreign observers had confirmed through photos and their ever-present smartphones nearly 60 tanks, air defense vehicles, supply trucks, and even locomotives that had fallen prey to TB2s. Yeah, it was a slaughter. But they didn't see it coming. Again, it's the rise of the drones that's the big story of this war. The Russians retreated. Ukraine's much ballyhooed southern counteroffensive in the summer of 2023 got mired in dense Russian minefields. Right. The reason that counteroffensive failed was because the Russians had time to prepare these minefields, had time to prepare all the fortifications and defense networks, and then the Ukrainians coming into that, an American army never would have attempted this, to go right through this without the combined air support, combined forces of, they would have these armored vehicles in the front, and then they'd have infantry coming through, and then they'd have air support keeping their opponents pinned down, but they didn't have the air support. So drones became over time like a close air support that the Ukrainians just didn't have before. Okay, the Russians counterattacked in early 2024 and taking advantage of the first spasms of American recalcitrance that starved Ukrainian units of urgently needed artillery ammunition. That was a terrible time when you have to, do I actually fire this artillery round or do I have to save this because we're running low? The Ukrainian incursion into western Russia's Kursk Oblast between August 2024 and February this year was an expensive and ultimately fruitless gambit on the part of the generals in Kyiv. Now, I kind of disagree and I kind of agree with that. Yes, it didn't work ultimately, but it also pulled a lot of Russians away from the Eastern Front as expected, expanding the front lines and stretching the Russians much thinner. So it wasn't a total success and it wasn't a total failure. But elsewhere along the 1,100-kilometer front line, the Russians' momentum dramatically slowed as 2024 turned into 2025, and the wider war entered its fourth year. Between September and March, Russian forces captured around 3,600 square kilometers of Ukraine, expanding their occupation zone from 110,000 square kilometers to 113,600 square kilometers. Now that sounds bad until you think about it like this. This is a country of 603,700 square kilometers. So 113, or that they went up by 3,600 out of 603,000, it's not a lot. Okay, so that led to slower Russian advances. Ukraine's 2022 counteroffensive liberated 4,200 square miles, not square kilometers, square miles of occupied territory. Any Russian gains since then have been marginal and have come at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties and thousands of increasingly difficult to replace vehicles. They just don't have the vehicles to be able to do what they did initially. Russia does not have the military power to seize the rest of Ukraine, according to the Institute for the Study of War in Washington. Ukraine's drones are the main reason why. This is why I emphasize drones so much. The small force of TB2s didn't survive past the 2023, but Ukraine's fast-growing defense industry, led by tech-savvy entrepreneurs, spread out across small workshops to add resilience, and boosted by periodic injections of cash by Ukraine's allies, replaced a few dozen multi-million-dollar TB2s with literally millions of tiny first-person view drones, each weighing just a few pounds and costing a few $100s. And it's amazing how devastating those drones can be. Now, I think this is right. Russia cannot win as long as Ukraine's drones hold the line. FPVs have utterly devastated the Russian war machine. Right now, Ukrainian FPV drones are the main killers of Russian troops and wreckers of Russian vehicles. I mean, it's just amazing what they can do. The Russians have drones too, of course. Ukraine drone technology is so far ahead, I don't think that Russia has any realistic potential to catch up, said Andrew Perpetua. I talk about Andrew Perpetua fairly frequently on my channel. Okay, so the tactical failure, Russia's armored columns are exposed. You just can't do what you used to do by just driving in your tanks and thinking you own the place. Russian assault group that attacked Ukrainian positions west of Andriivka in eastern Ukraine on or before April 3rd was unusually blessed with armored vehicles, but came to a typically bad end. It moved out in broad daylight. Forget about smoke, forget about clouds. It just, hey, we own the place. In a tightly packed column of at least a dozen armored vehicles carrying scores of infantry. And that used to be the way that you succeed, but nothing fails like success. When the lead vehicle was hit, the trailing vehicles piled up behind it. Their passengers bailed out, came under fire themselves. And soon the whole assault collapsed, and Ukrainian artillery and drones knocked out vehicle after vehicle. Swarms of drone hunted down the terrified survivors. This is the new normal for warfare. Russia, in theory, could have evolved, Perpetua explained. Instead, they've stubbornly rolled virtually their entire stock of armored vehicles, once the biggest in the world, across the drone-patrolled no man's land and squandered it. Numerically speaking, listen to this, numerically speaking, nearly every vehicle the Russians went to war with in February 2022 has been destroyed. Think about that. Squeezed by sanctions, Russian industry produces just 1,000 or so new armored vehicles a year, according to Jacob Janovsky, member of the Ornsk Intelligence Collective. The roughly 3,000 new armored vehicles Russia has built obviously can't fully replace the 17,000 vehicles that they have lost. Starting in late 2022, the Russians began to make good on the balance of their losses by pulling out older Cold War vintage vehicles out of long-term storage. They reactivated vehicles from the 1980s, the MT-LB armored tractors from the 1970s, T-55 tanks from the 1950s. They also ran out. So there will continue to be a stream of reactivated repaired equipment. But as the state of the vehicles in storage they have to work with gets worse and worse, those repairs will, beside being very costly, require more parts and more time. So they can do it, they can keep putting stuff out there, but it becomes less and less useful. Okay, as Ukrainian drones proliferated and Russian losses piled up, mechanized regiments demechanized, which is so weird. This is such a backwards thing in warfare. Now, the Russians adapted in a way. In 2023, the Kremlin bought thousands of Desert Cross ATVs from a Chinese firm for $20,000 apiece. It's a poor substitute for a 40-ton tank. The ATVs got wiped out. Next, the Russians began deploying inexpensive motorcycles. On April 17th, the assault in Pokrovsk involved about 150 bike troops, few of whom survived. And now, again, I just think this is just wasting these lives of these soldiers. It's really malpractice, but they keep doing it. Now, they're also sending troops into battle in old Lada compact cars. Civilian cars, vans, and trucks are extremely vulnerable, as you would imagine. So the drone-induced demechanization of the Russian army is a downward spiral. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse as time goes on. As long as factories are up and running, Russia will never actually run out of vehicles for regiments in Ukraine. Now, that's kind of like saying, when I was talking to an economist who was saying, well, we'll never run out of oil. No, you won't run out of oil, but eventually you'll become so cost prohibitive, you'll be seeking alternative uses rather than drilling for that last drop of oil. It's kind of like that. If Russia exhausts some equipment models, it will at first be able to replace them with some less optimal equipment, but eventually they're going to run out and be back to horses if they're not careful. Well, they're already using donkeys on the battlefield. More regiments will start walking into battle as a matter of course. I would expect that process to start around late 2025, said Janovsky. Wow. According to Janovsky, assaults would be far more likely to fail and cost far higher in casualties. But again, the Russians don't seem to value the lives of their men. in the same way that the Ukrainians do. So is this the end of Russia's mechanized doctrine? Well, perhaps. It should be like all militaries around the world should be paying attention to what's going on here. And China is, and they're thinking about this when they're thinking about Taiwan. It would be a nightmare for the generals and civilian leaders in Moscow, too, as they watch their chances of any meaningful victory slip away. And that is what's going to be happening. Since the 1920s, Russian way of war has ridden on tanks and wheels plied with steel and armor. And now it's being dismantled by those same drones. Russia cannot win as long as Ukraine's drones hold the line. Now, again, there's a arms race here with drone warfare improving and improving. So it went from electronically knocking down drones to FPV drones that were on fiber optic cables, and soon it'll be AI drones. And we even saw, I was talking yesterday about plywood drones with AI that were just hard to track by radar, right? Okay. Whether Ukrainians can take advantage of this impasse to achieve something that they can reasonably call victory is a separate question. But drones have changed warfare. Okay, my friends, tell me what you thought about this. I think this article is spot on, and drones are the way of the future. Not just aerial drones, there's ground drones. And some articles claim that ground drones are going to be even more game-changing than the aerial drones. Tell me what you think about this. Thank you for your time, the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.